Hi there. My name is Gavin Crump, and thank you for coming along to my presentation today. I'll begin by just introducing myself and thanking everyone that I need to thank, and then we'll launch right into my presentation, which is called Why Our BIM Burgers Need More Sauce. It's a little bit of a cheeky title, and you'll see sort of what it's all about quite soon. First of all, I'd like to thank the BIM Coordinators Summit team, especially ArcDocs, Ralph and Emma Montague, and the rest of the hardworking team behind the scenes. It's really great to know that there is an event people like us can actually convene at from around the world, both virtually but also in person. And I hope you're all having a really great time sharing your stories and also just enjoying being around people again after a couple of years of working fairly remotely. I'd like to thank all the other presenters for contributing their ideas, their stories, and also their success, hopefully as well at the summit. And I look forward to seeing a lot of other presentations on the day. Of course, I always like to thank my supporters, both directly and indirectly, who support me through various avenues that I work through. And also, of course, just all of you for being enthusiastic about BIM and data management and all those things that really keep us going in this industry. So, for those of you who haven't met me, my name is Gavin Crump. I'm from Australia in Sydney. I do have an architectural background. I've been working for roughly 11 years in the industry, so not quite a whippersnapper anymore. I've typically been delivering projects using the Revit platform, but do go fairly far outside the walls of Revit, especially when it comes to data management. For those that know me from YouTube, you'll know I'm a big enthusiast of Dynamo, Grasshopper, Python, PyRevit, all sorts of tools that enable us to process data in many more creative ways than what this platform can offer us. Having said that, I really do appreciate that there are many platforms, consultants, and parties out there that are using a lot of different platforms to Revit. So I do try to educate myself in the background on all of these as well. On a part-time basis, I work as a BIM consultant at BIM Guru, so my own business as a sole trader. And more recently, I did begin working part-time as a BIM slash computation slash automation lead at a group called BIM Consulting, who is parented by a large firm called Architectus. So I keep quite busy. So this is sort of what my average week is looking like. I'm doing quite a lot of things. So 2 days a week I'm consulting, and then 3 days a week in the middle I'm working with BIM Consulting at Architectus. So whilst I do a lot of things with data management at Architectus, most of what I talk about will relate to a more broad understanding of how I work and the opinions and ideas I have about data management in the industry. On the side, a lot of you might know me from YouTube, where I've sort of just recently hung up my shoes for a break. But I do have a channel called the Aussie BIM Guru, where I share a lot of workflows, ideas, and also solutions, hopefully, to problems a lot of us face in the industry, particularly around data management in the Dynamo and Revit platforms. And I also do distribute Revit content and templates at my website, courses.bimguru.education, on a part-time basis as well. So I keep pretty busy. But working as a BIM consultant is a really interesting opportunity to see how a lot of people use data, generate data, and often might need to change their workflows to better achieve what requirements are being placed upon them in their everyday project needs. So I have got to see through the eyes of clients, through other types of consultants, in addition to architects. So it's been a really great way to better appreciate what the goals are that we're trying to achieve when we're managing data on projects. Most of my clients are typically Australian based. Having said that, I've had clients in pretty much every continent, even technically one in Antarctica at a base, which is quite interesting. So I've pretty much touched all the continents in some way. I do focus a lot on automation enabled through well-managed data. And that really is crucial to how I can actually operate as a sole trader in this space as well personally. 3 days a week, I'm working with a consulting group at a large-scale architecture practice, and I do hope to be able to present with context around this in future on behalf of the firm as well. For now, I have consulted for roughly a year and a half to them, but I really have only just joined them part-time recently. I'm looking at building more scalable solutions because this is a firm of roughly 400 people. So I will be able to present some data management strategies more technically in future on the back of this. But I do work with a team of roughly 15 BIM/technical software specialists. So it's a really exciting opportunity, and I do look forward to being able to present on this in future as well. But due to the timing of when I actually engaged to do this presentation, this will not directly reflect my work with them, my opinions are my own, etc. Having said that, a lot of the things I talk about will naturally relate to the everyday work that I do anyway. So what's this all about? I've noticed, I guess at the moment, that some of the burgers, the BIM burgers we're delivering, are sometimes coming out a little bit stale, a little bit less exciting than the brief or the aspiration that we set. And I'm starting to notice that on average, we don't seem to be managing our data as well as we could be. And I do really have a pretty strong opinion that without well-managed data, without good data at the source, it's very hard to make BIM work at any stage in a project. So whether you're delivering information schemas or just trying to operate with technical platforms, I do think that without data management, there's really not much we can do. So we know that whilst there's a lot of aspirations to deliver BIM level 2, deliver all sorts of schemas, deliver all sorts of outcomes, we know it's not always this idyllic, right? And I think it's sort of come to a point where some people really are just waiting for us to get it all right. As BIM specialists, some architects really have just given up on BIM for now, I feel, when they're saying, let us know when you've solved all the problems and then we'll come to play. So I think as time goes on, it's actually getting more crucial. And we really do have to start working towards better systems and standards across the board. As a consultant, I've sort of come to see that often when you're trying to educate people on data management and standards, sometimes they're not even on the same hill to the one that you want to get them on. There are a lot of standards that just expect people to climb up an entirely different mountain, an entirely different approach to what they're used to. And I do feel sometimes some people are so far going up another hill that you almost have to work them back down and bring them back up another one just to bring them to a point where they can work to the way that the industry expects them to or might require them to. So this is becoming quite crucial, especially for consultants out there as well. So you can't always just sort of throw someone on a mountain and hope they know how to climb it. Guidance is still really crucial to making this all work, and will sort of be a bit of a recurring theme throughout this presentation. I'm noticing firms are still sort of waiting for things to work. They're sort of hanging out inside the proprietary black box, hoping that someone's going to fix the platforms they use. And I think it's becoming quite clear it's probably not going to happen. I do encourage firms and people to always look outside the boxes, always look for hints of what's coming. And I always recommend that people innovate instead of innovate, as I like to call it. Anyway, where's the source? This is really what I care about. Most people will know me from my content that I'm very into the tools. I do like to make things work from the ground up. I totally appreciate not everything is a ground up solution. Sometimes you do need to have a meeting first, determine what the right approach is, and then go to the tools. I totally appreciate that. But at the same time, I really do think sometimes we really don't leave enough time or realistic expectations to get it right at the source in the first place. So I think we can tackle most issues around the source through the pillars of BIM: people, process, and technology. I think everyone knows data entry is really where a lot of data management goes wrong, whether it's not clear enough how data needs to be entered, or we're doing abortive work, we have to remake work, we have to federate models together from all sorts of strange formats. And by the end of it, we're probably appending a whole bunch of data on the end just to comply with the standard until we dump the data off to the client. So it's not always a very clean process. I think most people are familiar with this. And sometimes what we needed was something much more flexible and malleable than what we get. Often we're handing over very static files, or files that our clients don't actually know how to do anything with. For example, either a native format model when they don't have any program that can work with it, or a very static format like an IFC model. So it's a real challenge. So where is it all going wrong is often what a lot of clients ask me. They say, why am I not getting what I need? Sometimes there are just too many cooks, too many people with too many ideas, and you sort of get analysis paralysis. You get stuck in the meeting loop, and suddenly no one's actually making any real decisions and actioning them. This is really real in big practice. But at the same time too, we do know clients don't always know what they want or what they need. And it is a challenging industry to tell someone that they might be wrong. Often as a consultant, I do have to tell clients, hey, this isn't actually what you need. This is what I think will actually meet your goals. And it's sometimes completely different to what they thought they needed. They might have in their head an idea that a vendor has put in their head 5 years ago, and they've just stuck with it. And it can be very hard to pivot away from something if you think you know what you want. But at the same time, I think there's a general sentiment that there's a feeling that the experts have overcomplicated what is required of BIM. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with it entirely, but it does seem to at least be a general consensus that outside the BIM professional circuit, It's very hard to engage with BIM and information standards unless you have a very good, capable, and available guide, such as a BIM manager. So often, I sort of just get the feeling that it's a bit of pill to swallow, especially for people that aren't involved with BIM, to actually work in a way that enables BIM. It sort of feels a little bit like this sometimes. But of course, we do want to frame solutions here, not just problems. One of the biggest challenges, I think, at least for me, from what I've seen in a country that's not mandated to deliver level 2 BIM or work to the ISO directly, is that there's a lot of standards. And there's not necessarily that many people that really understand the standards deeply enough to fully implement them in standard project models. Sometimes you'll be working on a job and there's maybe 2 people in the combined project team that really get what needs to be done to achieve some pretty high level standards that maybe a client or a project manager might have prescribed to the team. For example, LOD is a very familiar one that's very grey and hard to prescribe to a project unless everyone has a good understanding of what it means in the context of the project. And as a result, I find sometimes with all these standards to measure, very few of them are able to be verified at the end because there's just too much to tick. So one recommendation that I'm working with myself, but I've seen good success with as well, is to actually just try to cherry pick the things that really matter out of all these standards and talk about them early enough that you can actually form goals as a team around them. Yes, some standards are very prescribed in a way that you do have to tick most of the boxes, for example, Kobe data export. But if you can identify the key things that are actually going to be the biggest challenges to implementing this standard, I found you can actually get much better buy-in from the team, from the clients. Some standards are much easier to cherry pick from, especially when you're not working in a UK market where the mandations aren't present. For example, ISO 19650. Sometimes you only really need to identify the core processes and parties involved, and that can often be enough to at least form some consensus about portions of the standard that really matter in the context of the project. So this is something I do recommend to people in at least the non-UK market, but I know in the UK market it's a little bit of a different ballgame. I'm noticing, and I don't know if everyone agrees with me here, but that there's a lot of software viewers really being developed in the market, but not so many authoring platforms. Authoring BIM is very complicated. These programs aren't easy. They're effectively visual databases, and I think it's maybe become a bit too difficult to comprehend building a whole new BIM platform from the ground up. We've become very used to the fact that we might just be stuck with the authoring platforms we have, at least for the short to mid-term. So I am sort of concerned that, the only one I can really think of off the top of my head is Blender BIM or maybe IFC.js. And the entry level isn't definitely at a point where the average user can engage with it. So I am sort of a little bit concerned that maybe this is one reason why authoring is sometimes a big challenge. But also people, of course, it's not just technology. I've noticed there is a divide in management culture in terms of how much people understand about the tools. So I often am having to encourage managers to at least take a little bit of time to talk to their technical team so that they can sort of break down what's actually happening behind the scenes, just so at least they can make better decisions, better timing, and also know how to verify what data is actually being captured in the model, or at least so they can communicate with those people. Because I feel like if you don't have the ability to use technology, at least to the capacity of working with a team that uses it, then you might be a part of a problem. So I am always trying to encourage managers that I work with or consult to at least learn how to better engage with technology or people engaging with technology as well. And I think there's also another really big challenge in the market, and I think most markets have seen this. I know in Australia, we're definitely seeing a skill shortage, especially around the 3 to 5 year mark of experience with authors, coordinators, and managers of BIM. I'm not quite sure exactly what's caused it, but I think a lot of people have jumped ship to other industries. So we seem to still have a high demand for people that are very experienced construction-wise, programmers, affordable. Those 4 things don't tend to go together, which has led to this trend of the super user. And I do have to encourage the industry to find ways around the super user. Never have one person that does everything related to BIM in an office or a project. Having said that, I've been one of these people before, and it doesn't tend to work. At the very best, they're probably going to leave. And at the very worst, they're going to get overworked and make mistakes. So we need to find ways to spread the authoring responsibility and understanding beyond just power users on projects. This is a trend that is very hard to break, But I think due to the skill shortage, we're going to have to learn how to. So how do we solve these authoring challenges? Well, there's lots of things we could do. Of course, we could make more standards. We could train up authors. But there's an interesting phenomenon I wanted to briefly touch on that I'm actually seeing from a consultant's perspective that isn't actually one I expected, and it's sort of a response to these challenges. And that is that I'm seeing some BIM savvy clients emerging as authors or maintainers of models, which is quite interesting. Because many clients have started to realize the BIM model is something that's quite expensive to pay for, and it actually can contain quite a lot of valuable data, especially if they want to hand this building on to other authors in future to update or modify that model as a representation of the physical twin of that building. So I actually have come across quite a lot of clients that are building in-house teams to manage authored model software. So, for example, Revit, and they're developing their own standards, auditing the models against them, modifying the models in tandem with actual operational decisions. So if they maintain their facility, sometimes they might actually author this data back to source or push it back to source. And they're actually using these models to commission future works as well. They're keeping their BIM burgers fresh. Now, obviously, this is an interesting one because they're taking something away from what we could have done for a client, which would be to actually maintain their models for them to the point that they can use them. But as a result of, I guess, us, not necessarily managing to do that, we're seeing that responsibility fall to some clients. Of course, they have BIM consultants sometimes as well that maintain that for them. But many of the clients have started to point out to me in these cases that the data they're getting from a lot of their consultants is highly inconsistent until they actually set a standard and say, this is what we need. So just a little challenge I like to put forward to BIM managers out there especially is to just take any two projects in your office at one time and just compare something that should be the same. For example, the most simple wall you could have in a project. A stud wall, one layer of plasterboard stopping at the ceiling or just above. That should be the same code, right? It really doesn't have an excuse to be different. But in most offices that I've challenged people on this, it's different. We're so idiosyncratic on some things that really should just be consistent, should be clean, consistent data. And, ultimately, if we're not, we're wasting money. So it's an interesting challenge when you notice that even in-house, we really struggle as an industry to just pick things and stick to them. There's also the challenge of storing data. This is one that I've especially had to put to myself during my data management journey. There's many containers out there. CSV, JSON, XML, IFC is arguably container, even though a more fluid one, you could say. But we know most people are typically using Excel. Now, I used to love Excel. It was great. It stores all sorts of data, all sorts of formatting. You can make lots of graphs in it. But it's very hard to keep structured data in Excel. All you need is for one person to add a column or move something, and suddenly your data structure is gone. It's just not there. So I've actually moved away from Excel. I appreciate clients often need to use some format like Excel because it's human readable and understandable, but then you at least still need to educate people on how to keep these files in a structure that can go somewhere else. It's really important because good data has structure. Bad data does not. Copy one, final.rvt. So I've also had to educate clients on the principle of the handle. So one field to rule them all, one reliable piece of data that is always the same and can be relied on as the carriage between other platforms and formats. We might know, for example, element ID or GUID as a common way of doing this. The problem for clients is that they don't really understand this principle, and to them, that number means very little on the surface. It's not really an easy asset number, for example, to recognize. So good data has to make sense. There's another challenge that I've come across. And I'm not talking about the names of parameters here. I'm talking about the things that we put into them, the data that actually is what clients are hunting for, searching for, filtering, using. Very simple example of a system of how I manage data inside data itself. Everyone's got one of these sort of approaches, so I'm not saying that mine's better, mine's the one to use. Just a universal coding system is an example. The key thing here being that I use things like delimiters to break data into chunks and also keep it visually understandable. So I use a universal coding system, for example, where I have a class, a type, a class and type combined. to form an overall object and then a variant. So we're all quite familiar with these types of systems, but the point is that I had to pick very consistent delimiters and stick to them like glue, which isn't always something that firms are good at. Having been a consultant working on my own, obviously it's an echo chamber. I can pretty much do what I want and be as consistent as I can be. I appreciate it's a lot harder in big practice to do this, and I've experienced it myself. But I've learned that if you can get that consistency down, your data becomes so much more powerful than the platform you feed it through. Because at the end of the day, if you can rely on your data in one format to be correct, you can map this to all sorts of things. And I'm teaching clients about this as well, that they don't have to get necessarily every data schema into their objects from day one. They just need to know what they can rely on and use that as a means of pushing other data around. An example of data opening up different possibilities is that when I'm working with my standard, I can be quite flexible and not really worry about things like categories of objects in Revit, which is arguably a Revitism. We all know things like generic models in Revit or IFC proxy objects, sort of nothing classes, data that is accidental, consequential. When I work with my furniture in my model, I'm often working cross-category using the data fields to identify what's furniture instead, for example, because I have a consistent prefix. So I can sort of ignore things that the program forces me to do and use a system that makes much more sense in data itself. I take this all the way down to how I name my fields, of course, but as a result, I know exactly what things should be called. I can group things together programmatically when I'm pushing around data, parameter jamming things together, and setting other data based on different sets of data. Of course, it took a long time to set this up, and a lot of other firms have their own system of this. And of course, I've put idiosyncrasy in there through prefixing it myself. So it's not necessarily going to be a one-size-fits-all recommendation. This is just an architectural approach, of course, as well. So it's just one very small example. But the point is that because I have a system that I can predict, I can start to build mapping relationships to other data sets as they emerge. For example, I know pretty reliably the types of enums of furniture I can apply to objects based on the typical codes I use. At the same time, I can build control tables that equate this also to things like uniclass fields. So rather than having to have all this data all the time, I can just set up mapping tables instead, which is much more straightforward. And I sort of feel like this is probably where the industry will end up eventually. They're going to end up having to have equivalency between all these classifications we're creating. So we sort of end up with the BIM level who thing. How are we dealing with this as an industry, especially in Australia? And this sort of becomes my baseline recommendation point, particularly for non-UK markets. I feel like if firms are in a position where they are operating with BIM, so not just Revit or ArchiCAD, but BIM, and you're not in a position where you can create good quality IFC models that are workable, or at least embedding classification data for use, or preparing FM-related data schemes, it might be a point to actually act or proact versus react, because eventually you won't have a chance to proact. So I think in preparation, if you're not doing these things, you should at least make sure that in-house your data standards are clean and clear. A lot of firms are still reinventing their wheels, and it's not always necessarily with the right intent. I do recommend all clients and people working for clients to talk about data standards and what data actually matters and how it's going to be measured. But as well as that, that you need to make sure that people understand what the data is doing, and you're hiring people that actually get what data is, how they can use it, how they can avoid reinventing it over and over again, and actually rely on BIM in more creative ways than they probably are already. Because one day, every client will know how to reject this burger. They'll know how to say, sorry, that's not the burger I ordered, try again. And we're going to have to move pretty fast if we can't do that. Change is hard, but change is inevitable. Not everyone will probably be old enough to recognize that brand down the bottom, but it used to be a very popular camera brand, and they didn't change, and they're not here anymore. We've all got cameras in our phones now, so yep, they definitely didn't change fast enough. But I guess in conclusion, I've really just tried to reinforce that I feel like being selective with standards is the starting point for finding out how data should be managed in the context of projects or organizations. Beyond that, actually getting a clean, consistent standard in-house is really at the point of being necessary by this point, especially in markets that are not necessarily mandated right now, but could eventually fall under the same sort of scenario as the UK, or I should say the opportunity as the UK. It's definitely an opportunity. So learning how to process and map data based on handles is something that not only I think firms need to do, but also teach their clients to do. Otherwise, it's really hard to make operational BIM actually work. Go outside Excel. If you've never used CSV or JSON, try these at least. And of course, IFC is always valid. And I really encourage ultimately to spread responsibility because information management ultimately is everyone's responsibility. We're all creating data in one form or another, whether intentionally or by product or by accident, but we're all responsible for what we create. And in conclusion, this is actually my quote from last year, but it's just such a good quote. I think that we all do heroic things, but hero is not a noun, it's a verb. So thank you for listening. And I look forward to answering your questions and seeing more presentations at the summit. And that's all. Thank you.